Hello, good morning. So, as Jerry mentioned, I'm going to talk about my PhD a bit. Not the research itself per se, but more the practicalities around doing a PhD and how that worked out for myself. So, as you can see, this is my research topic. At the moment, the title has changed. It might change again. And I am currently in the third year of my PhD, but I will talk about that a bit more. So, to explain this, I need to tell you a little bit about my background. I did my MA in Research in Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading, and it's referred to as an MA Res, and what an MRes does by nature is it sort of sets you up for doing a PhD. It gives you the tools you need to do self-directed research. So things like how to go about coming up with research questions, critical thinking, analysis, and structuring your writing to argue the points that you want to make. And while I was there, I spent quite a lot of time in the archives. University of Reading has an extensive archive of material for various scripts, and I realized during this time that I found it really fun, this process of discovery and discovery, analysis, documenting what you would find was really satisfying for me. With archives, you sometimes go in with some questions that you have, and those questions end up changing depending on the material that you find. So there's this ongoing dialogue with the material that was really satisfying for me. And beyond that, another side of my personal life, I come from a family of academics. A lot of high thinking, no common sense. This is my dad's PhD. I don't even know what the title means. But yeah, it's a family that sets expectations by example. So I decided I wanted to do a PhD, probably. As most of you know, PhDs can be very expensive, especially if you're an international student. Funding can be very hard to come by, especially if you're an international student. So that very practical point was the reason why there was a 2-year gap between graduating from Reading in September 2015 and 2 years later, I had already accomplished the task of getting a very expensive degree that didn't really make me much more hireable. Not really. So 2 years later, I became aware of an opportunity to do a PhD with this title, Punjabi Printing in Post-War Britain, and there was a very attractive prospect of funding attached to it, and they just wanted someone who was the right candidate to do the research. Had I sat down and thought about the research topic that I wanted to dedicate 3 years of my life to, probably I would not have written down the words Punjabi Printing in Post-War Britain. But it was still a fantastic opportunity. It still gave me the chance to use the tools that I had acquired in my MA and build on them and refine them. So I applied, and I got it, and more importantly, I got the funding. And it's a really good funding, so beyond the fact that it covers tuition, it also gave me a living stipend. So I started my PhD on Punjabi Printing in Post-War Britain at the University of Birmingham in 2019, almost 3 years ago today. And my supervisors are Professor Caroline Archer and Professor Fiona Ross. So it is between the University of Birmingham and the University of Reading. There's some supervision coming in on Fiona's part there. Now, when I say that this is covered, the tuition is fully covered, I'm an international student again, so it's not really fully covered. I still have to pay 2/3 of the tuition out of my own pocket. So I knew that I needed a part-time job to go along with my research. And that is where the Center for Print History and Culture comes in. The Center for Print History and Culture is, quote, exists to stimulate, support, publicize, and disseminate knowledge of printing history and culture. It's exactly what they do. It's very self-explanatory. And they do it on a considerable scale, so I invite you to maybe make a note of their URL and sign up for their newsletter if you want to know about all the different activities that they do. I got to be a member of the CPHC, and I was hired as the research assistant to the center. So I got to do things like this. With the help of Daryl Lim and Vaibhav Singh from the University of Reading, we put together a conference in June 2018, Script Prints and Letter Forms in Global Contexts, the Visual and the Material. It was a very fruitful event for us. A book is now coming out on the back of this conference. So it was a very ideal situation for me because I was getting to do my research, I was getting the help I needed to fund it, and I was also building up my CV, my academic CV, by doing things like this. And then there's the fact of Birmingham itself. It's a real gem of a city for people who are passionate about typography. There are many archives, rich archives in the city, like the Typographique Hub. There's the Cadbury Research Library. There's the Library of Birmingham. And what you see here is Winterbourne House and Gardens, where they have several 19th century printing presses that they continuously run and have workshops with. So I spent the first 12 months of my research going to these archives and other archives in London and Oxford. And what I was finding was a wealth of material on the Gurmukhi script. Now, I should mention that, as you recall, my research was on the printing history of Punjabi, and the interesting thing about the Punjabi language is it's written with two scripts, one being a variant of Arabic called Shahmukhi, used in eastern Pakistan, and in North India, a relative of the Brahmi scripts, which is the Gurmukhi script. And what I was finding a lot in these archives was samples of the Gurmukhi script, and a lot of material that I found were not documented elsewhere in the literature that I was reading, also in those first 12 months, a lot, trying to get contextual information. Typefaces not being thoroughly analyzed and just historically documented, like Linotype Gurmukhi light and bold from the 80s. Resources that existed only in the form of letters. So there was 100 odd pages of Oxford University Press's process between the developers of this font of Gurmukhi. And, these can be just destroyed and damaged or lost at any point in time, and they were not documented. 2 cases of almost new type, and just something as simple as finding something that previous literature stated earliest dates of being 1811, and then finding a letter from William Carey of the Serampore Missionary Press stating that it was actually 1809. And I know that can seem a little bit petty, but it's actually exciting when you come across information like that. And if I documented it as being 1809 now, maybe in 5 years someone else will come and say, oh, actually I found something from 1800, and that's great. That's how it should be. We build on the research that comes before us and set up for the future researchers. So what I was finding was a lot of material on Gurmukhi, and I had gone in with my own passion of Arabic for this research, but it's again that dialogue with archival material, and my focus thus shifted to Gurmukhi because, you can only do so much in 3 years. So that helped to define my scope. I now am looking strictly, as you saw in the title page, on the Gurmukhi script. And also because I am not someone who knows how to read and write Punjabi, or I did not grow up immersed in their culture, I am acknowledging this. I am only focusing on the printing that was being done by British and North American printers. So an outsider looking at outsiders' work. And as Jerry mentioned yesterday, documenting this historic process of development, but also that sort of lens, that sort of perspective of looking at this opens up this discussion about intentions of outsiders printing for another culture and community, what sort of mindset they approached it with. And it's very difficult to try and pinpoint intention because sometimes people do things and even they don't know why they do it, but that also opens up an exciting sort of road for analysis and theorizing. So that was the first 2 years of my research. I spent a lot of time in archives and contextual reading and documenting what I was finding. And it was after 2 years that I had to step back a bit from my responsibilities at the Center for Print History, and funding became an issue. And as I'm sure everyone who is doing or has done a PhD knows, you start to live in your head a lot. It was an unhealthy amount at some point for me. I was living alone in my apartments in Birmingham. I was isolated, and I made the decision to switch from part-time to switch from, full-time PhD to part-time and full-time work. So now I work 8 hours a day at Dalton Mogg, which is a design studio in London. It's a type design studio in London. It's not my desk, but someone else who's very neat. And this is the training process. We start with 1 week of calligraphy, but I digress. It's not easy doing a part-time PhD when you're doing full-time work every day, but what I found works for me quite well is trying to, even if for 15 minutes, sit down and be present with my research, even if it's just to catch up on what I've read the day before. I try to do this. Some days it works much better. A wave of writing hits and I can write it and write a good amount of words. And some days I will go and read what I had written the day before and I can clearly see how exhausted I must have been by the time I sat down to write. So those are not good words, but it's still progress. At this point, I've set a very nerdy, ambitious plan to finish my research within the next year, as you can see with dates and everything. My funding will run out in a year. That's a very good incentive to finish it. And I have this goal of writing 1,500 words a week to make that possible. Sometimes that works. Sometimes I'm in Amiens and it doesn't work quite well. But that's okay, because things balance themselves out. If I write a little bit less this week, maybe next week I write a lot more. And eventually things always seem to balance themselves out. And I have a lot of internal guilt and shame. So if I say I'm going to send something on a particular day, I will just force myself for 2 days to sit at my computer and write so I can make that deadline. That's it. I'm just going to end by saying this weird and awkward point. You know how to cancer patients or, yeah, that's bad. Let's say it differently. Patients that have to go through major surgery, they ask if you have a support system. I think it should be the same for people who want to do a PhD. I think people should be asked if they have a support system, which I do. I like to think that I'm not a quitter, and I would stick with this regardless, but a PhD is hard, it is intense, you live with your topic every day. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, you think about your topic. So for me, it's been lovely having a family that understands how difficult it is, having gone through it themselves, and have their constant support. A partner who understands this, who cooks dinner so I don't have to, so I can sit down and write. And I think everybody should sort of consider that very much before diving into something that requires so much of you. That's it. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is P.Dočekalová, and I'm a PhD candidate at Type Design and Typography Studio, led by the Associate Professors Tomáš Brousil, who you probably know as a Suitcase Type Foundry, Radek Sidon, who's in the audience, and Karel Halon, at Academy of Art, Architecture and Design in Prague, Czech Republic, or in short we use UMPRUM Academy. This is my school. Or actually, this is my new school. To be accurate, we are expanding and building a new building that should be finished next year, hopefully. After surviving my master thesis at Type Design Studio, I became a kind of a new sign painter who designs contemporary handwritten scripts. My diploma goal has been to revive a craft of sign painting that did not survive the digitization in Czech Republic and almost completely disappeared. After my master, I entered a year-long postgraduate postmac position at UMPRUM, That allowed me to be a part-time assistant in our studio and to work on some of my long-term projects, like the book about Jaroslav Benda that you see now. With support of my school, I was also able to travel to type conferences and join workshops, etc. But most of all, I was able to continue my work of expanding our local writing traditions. Postmac was an ideal preliminary for a PhD studies, so naturally it really outgrown there. Evolving of a new Czech lettering script was still my main topic, and it grew very fast. Upgrade to PhD studies was a logical step, so it happened in 2017 when I entered the position. But just briefly about our school. Our school PhD program divides the study and the final outcome into two parts: a written theoretical text or thesis in form of a book, and an artwork that is based on the findings of the study and verifying it in practice. Both parts has two opponents and are equally judged at the final critique and exam. That makes the study and work more complicated and credible at the same time. Our PhD program fundings are low, but on the contrary, UMPRUM supported my expenses connected with research and travels and joining workshops and being here in Amiens, so that's good. I believe it's a necessary part of the PhD studies to be active in a school studio where you operate, partly teach, and are part of commissions and admissions, and in the entire professional field too. Talks, conferences, and networking are as important as the relationship between theory and practice. That's also why I organize workshops and hold lectures in other schools and for the public also. My PhD topic was very wide at the first months. The base of my work drew from the local lettering tradition. Czechoslovakia has a rich history of advertising, sign painting, and penmanship, but writing with pointed pen and drawing with brushes and mouthstick was slowly replaced by filling in stencils. Sign painters stopped noticing and writing by hand because of the rise of digital fonts. So the script slowly fell into oblivion, and now it's completely disappeared and forgotten craft. Sign painting nowadays in Czech Republic is form of an art that doesn't face any important issue. The sign painting communities and individuals write all over the world, and its craft is made their way into contemporary retail design. But I found much problematic part in handwriting that I've decided to solve properly. So I'd like to share with you my conclusions, questions, and work in progress, even though it's not yet finished. I'm into my last months, and the outcome will be expected in August, and I might change minor details. I've started with the visual culture of the street and its overall terrifying level of signs that I came across every day and everywhere. I know that we live in the 21st century and we don't write everything by hand every day. But where did such a poor handwriting throughout society came from? And is it nowadays or not that recently issue? I looked at the first crucial thing, school writing cursive, and therein lies the rub. This is what a copy of a Czech school writing cursive looks like today. Czech school children are learning from a slightly modified model from 1950s. Without any pedagogical knowledge, only as a typographer, I'd immediately say it needs a fundamental redesign. But a superficial typographic redesign is not the way to go, especially because there are methodological and paleographical parts that needs to be fully respected. Instead, I've been asking myself, what could a correct, local, contemporary skeleton of a Czech script or Czech cursive look like? So the verification and simplification of this sample skeleton is the main topic of my research. I studied the development of humanistic italic, and I focused on Czechoslovak educational text, dealing with the teaching methodology and materials of school handwriting. In terms of teaching writing, I learned some facts that are fascinating for my process of work. A letter shape is not important or that important. The brain remembers the character as a rhythmic sequence of directions. It's right when the characters are very different from each other. It's the differences that enable faster letter memorization. Another surprise, fine motor skills require a demanding skeleton. A child learns more complicated shape, which during puberty simplifies into an original manuscript in adulthood. Next, the writing cursive should be as visually different as possible from print typeface, so that the brain can remember both of these positions under one meaning. Handwriting should be also faster than typing it into a computer. A cursive doesn't need to raise the tool, thus slowing down the writing. Also, it is necessary to learn to write in connected script. Writing with a connected script strongly supports the memory. If the model is not linked, the child makes mistakes in creating the space in between words and letters. Which also was proven by another PhD work from my school, the Comania script used since 2006. Sadly, Comania was never accepted by our school, but it's still in a test process. Luckily, more projects of school cursive are rising, and one of the reasons is from Slovakia. The authors of the redesign are typographer Jan Filipek and designer Martina Rozinajová. As I said before, the fact that our school combines theory and practice led me to do the experiment of recreating the cursive by myself. I started with a humanistic italic that underwent several shape changes through 20th and 19th century, during which became a national script after the transition from the German language. The contemporary Czech school cursive was established in 1950s. Original design is dated 1932. There, most uppercase letters were replaced by their lowercase counterparts. The shadowing disappeared due to the resistance to pointed pens, and the letters had a naive, childish look. I took a lesson about lowercase and uppercase letters and tried to distinguish them so every letter would have at least two versions. Probably the nicest one came from 1909, which has a pleasant tilt, fine shadowing, and can be written really quickly. From my perspective, this offers nice open terminals that could speed up handwriting pretty well. For nearly 2 centuries, Czechs were writing in German language. Austro-Hungarian current script stabilized its inconsistency of handouts and is justly the starting point of my letter search. Current was written very quickly, however, the ductus is too narrow, the tilt too vertical, and the difference in X-high versus uppercase significant. This feature makes current too sharp to be easily modified, even though its skeleton is close to our writing habit. So I wondered, what if I can go even further for the shape origin? Until now, it hadn't occurred to me to think about black letter. The transition between printed type and the written cursive is bastarda, which every nation adapted to its writing habit, and bastarda ruled in our land under more than 300 years. As opposed to textura or rotunda, which had to be written slowly, bastarda offers time-saving and likable skeleton. Also, it contains stable character shapes in the form we should be using today. Bastarda can be written very quickly, and its structure directly encourages modifications with up-to-date tools, especially with folded pens and markers. So I think I can use its skeleton as a base to find an answer on this question. Is it possible to make a cursive out of black letter, which is not a script on its true essence? And is it possible then that a script from the 14th century could become a model for searching for contemporary aesthetics and correct wrong writing habits? It could possibly become this. My expected outcome is not to design a new Czech school cursive. A re-examination and the research of a valid local morphology creates for me a foundation for my own development of new letter forms. I'm trying to fix a sample chain mistake, and maybe I fail, let's see, but we all should have some playground, don't we? Thank you for your attention. I look forward to discussion.
My name is Borna B.Izadpanah, and I'm a doctoral researcher in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading in the UK, where I also graduated from the MA in Typeface Design course in 2015. I began my PhD research in 2016, and currently I am in the fourth and hopefully final year of my PhD. This research project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council under the auspices of the Design Star Doctoral Training Center, and I am fortunate to have two amazing supervisors, Professor Jerry Leonidas, who is here, no pressure, and Professor Fiona Ross, who is unfortunately not here. And this gives me a very good combination of Jerry, who does Latin, and Fiona, who does no Latin. My area of interest is generally the history of Arabic script printing and typography, but as far as my PhD research is concerned, the history of Persian language printing and typography. And for those of you who may not know, Persian is a language of the Indo-European family, which has been written in modified or extended Arabic script for over a millennium. So after this brief introduction that Jerry asked us to include in our presentation, I would like to briefly discuss some aspects of my PhD research that hopefully you will find of interest. My interest in printing and typography predates my education in Reading, but it was during the MATD course which I became determined to pursue a PhD. The dissertation that I wrote for my MA course investigated the typographic development of the Nastaliq style, which is a writing style generally used to represent the Persian language and some of the South Asian languages, especially Urdu. This early investigation, which was quite incomplete, more than answering some of my questions, raised many more and made me aware of the fact that very little has been done in my area of work, and this needs further investigation, which even more encouraged the idea of doing a PhD. Like many of my peers, I started with a very ambitious plan. I said I'm going to cover the entire history of Persian language printing, but soon I realized that this was not practical and I had to narrow down my scope. So currently I'm focusing on early modern period plus a few decades in 19th century. One of the reasons that initially I had this ambitious plan was that I really didn't know if I will be able to find enough materials from different periods, from different regions that I could write about. To give you an example, in the beginning I was not sure if I will be able to find much about the beginning of Persian language printing in Europe. Most of the sources which were available to me were focused on the history of Arabic script printing, and there was hardly any mention of the first book printed in the first Persian book printed in Europe and the first attempts to design Persian types. My investigation, however, led to important findings and became, I think, one of the most important contributions of my PhD research. This was mainly based on the discovery of the Persian typographic materials of the Medici press in the archive of the Imprimerie Nationale, which is actually not far from here, and the complementary documents in Italian archives. In conducting this part of my research and more generally defining my research approach, I benefited from a set of rare resources and expertise which our department has to offer. Exploring the non-Latin type collection has been the starting point for myself and several other PhD researchers who began their work in Reading. Valuable PhD theses written by previous researchers, some of whom are here today, aided me to refine the structure of my thesis, and also I learned a lot from their experiences in dealing with less studied subjects. In addition to my supervisors, other members of the department have also been instrumental in the development of my research. In particular, Professor Michael Twyman's writing, his show and tell sessions, and my continued discussions with him has had a major impact on my approach to the history of printing and typography, especially with regard to the study of primary sources, looking at the original artifacts, examining different processes of printing, and critical analysis of the secondary sources. I should also mention the importance of having discussions with my other fellow PhD students. I was lucky enough to do my PhD at more or less the same time as a number of other PhD students whose work was somehow related to my work, and this led to very fruitful exchanges and some collaborations. My research also faced a number of foreseen and number of challenges, some of them foreseen, some of them unforeseen. One of the main difficulties has been the issue of OCR, or optical character recognition, for the Arabic script. This technology has seen a significant improvement since I began my PhD, but still nowhere close to what is available for the Latin script. On top of that, many of the Arabic script sources, especially newspapers, books, and journals, are not yet digitized. And if you're lucky enough to locate them in other formats, such as original document, facsimiles, or microfilms, you will need to often spend hours, days, or even months to explore them. The problem of transliteration or romanization of sources written in Arabic script and searching them in catalogs. There are various methods of transliteration of names and titles written in languages that use the Arabic script. This is even more problematic with regard to sources compiled prior to the 20th century. To give you an example, if you are investigating the history of printing in the very famous Bulak press in Cairo, these are only some of the variations that you will find in the catalogs. Just to transliterate the name Bulak, which actually in Arabic pronounced Bulak, if I'm not mistaken. So, even after overcoming all of these difficulties to locate a source, this does not necessarily guarantee that you will be able to consult it. My recent experience with regard to the surviving copies of the first newspaper in Iran is a good example to highlight a number of issues. Sources available to me suggested that there are only 2 copies of this newspaper which are kept at the Library of the British Museum, which later became the British Library. I also had seen low-quality reproduction of these copies, which was not good enough to study different aspects of their printing. My initial investigation in the British Library catalog and other sources only led me to a microfilm, and no original copies could be located. I was ultimately able to find a clue in some of the not yet digitized Persian journals, with which I managed to locate these copies in a large anonymous volume of various newspapers. This also shows the significance of the sources written in the non-European languages, that some of the existing studies of this history have not included in their research. Another issue of the research that researchers like myself frequently encounter is finding sources held by antiquarians, auction houses, or private collections. In fact, I was recently contacted by a fellow Iranian living in the US who, to my surprise, informed me that he has been able to acquire a few other issues of this newspaper, which he found in an antiquarian shop in Vienna. I'm really hoping to see some images of these newspapers, but he lives in Washington, and this is not the best time for Iranians to travel to the US. I was hacked. There are, in fact, many cases like this. Most of us know about the unfortunate fate of linotype drawings, which ended up in auction houses, in antique shops, and even on Etsy website. This means that even, in case of, I lost it. Oh, in the best cases, these drawings end up in collections and archives which are available, open to scholars. But in some cases, they may end up in private collections and may not be seen again for a very long time. These are some of the early Arabic drawings of Linotype company. They say it's from 1910, 1911, and this must be one of the earliest examples of pattern drawing in Linotype. And I don't know what happened to them. The price for this was estimated between 20,000 and 25,000 pounds. So really, researchers like myself, a lot of time you really need to count on your luck to come across many of the sources which may not be immediately available to you. And the final point that I want to discuss, and I hope you won't find this a bit too angry, it's studying the history of printing and its relevance today to what we do today. Studying the history of printing and typography in different languages that use the Arabic script, in my case, and exploring the development of writing styles and typographic taste in different regions can contribute to modern practice. With my research, I'm hoping to highlight the significance of regional and linguistic diversity, which has been instrumental in the evolution of the Arabic script. However, this is rarely echoed in contemporary typeface design. I cannot emphasize enough that today it is not sufficient to simply design typefaces with extended character set to cover other languages, but we need more typefaces that are specifically designed to meet the stylistic and linguistic requirements of those languages. Nor typefaces of some writing systems of the world should be treated as an extension to an existing Latin typeface. It is highly problematic that even in the third decade of the 21st century, the writing systems of the world continue to be hastily modified or distorted to meet the restrictions that the Latin-oriented software and technology impose. Every language and writing system, regardless of the size of their user community, deserves proper representation. Major Silicon Valley corporations that are responsible for producing UI typefaces have the social responsibility to provide more effective tools for language communities that have been suffering from the uninformed decision of developers and designers, which has affected several aspects of their textual communication. And I would like to end with this quote from an excellent article entitled "Good Citizenship: Design as a Social and Political Force" by Catherine McCoy. Functionalism is narrowly defined in measurable utilitarian terms. Too often, this means serving the client's definition of function, generally profits, over other concerns including safety, the environment, and social, cultural, and political impacts. Universalism has brought us the homogenized proper corporate style based mainly on Helvetica and the grid, ignoring the power and potential of regional, idiosyncratic, personal, or culturally specific stylistic vocabularies. And the ideal of value-free design is a dangerous myth. In fact, all design solutions carry a bias, either explicit or implicit. The more honest designs acknowledge their biases openly rather than manipulate their audiences with assurance of universal truth and purity. Thank you.
So I'm very sorry because I have a low voice today. So I'm S.Kremer. I'm going to present you the way I conducted from 2014 to 2018 a research project in type design and lexicography as a PhD student at the ANRT, the National Institute for Typographic Research, and at ATypI, a research unit specialized in linguistics. Okay. It's not working. Okay. So I first studied graphic design and typography in various applied art school. Then I specialized in type design as a postmaster student, first here at ESAD Amiens, then in ANRT in Nancy. Then I keep working on the project I started as a postmaster degree as a PhD student in linguistics. This research project was directly based on type design and typography practice. Now I'm teaching here typography and type design to undergraduates, and I also give workshops in type design and schools. And I also do some freelance work as a type designer and graphic designer. So for my PhD, I work on the typographical aspect of an etymological dictionary of the Gallo-Roman languages that is called the Französisches Etymologisches Wörterbuch, that I will call the FEW. So here is the title of my thesis, the material realization of the FEV, the impact of typography on the development of lexicographical projects. Few words about the FEV. So the FEV is mainly the work of its founder, the Swiss linguist Walter von Warburg. The aim of each article of this dictionary is to reconstruct the history of a family of words. The article take as a starting point an etymon, that is the root word, from which the lexicographer explained the history of all the family of words through chronological and geographical criteria. This huge work takes 25 volumes, about 16,000 pages. As the publication started in 1922 and it's still going on, the technology of typesetting and also the display of the articles changed. And as you can see in the image, not necessarily in a good way. 3 of the 25 volumes are currently being digitalized to make the use of the dictionary wider and easier. The technical parts of the work of my thesis consisted in designing a custom typeface family to typeset the computerized dictionary. The font needed to include some specific characters used to typeset phonetic transcriptions. Both design and encoding of these characters were problematic. As a part of the work, a part of the work was to understand how the dictionary was made during almost 1 century of publication. The study was based on an analysis of the evolution of the dictionary, looking very closely to its layout. It was a way to highlight how technical changes and also lexicographical changes took place during the publication. These observations were a way to know precisely which typographic elements were specific to the FEV, but also what could be changed. The practical design work resulted from these technical and historical observations. And a typeface family called Walter has been created. It is tailored to the needs of the FEV users. Here you have a look to the 4 different styles that are used to typeset an extract of the dictionary. And here, a layout for the newly edited article that has been designed. It will be used to typeset the article as PDF. The layout paid tribute to the first volume of the FEV. And also to give access to the computerized article, a consultation interface is under construction. It is the result of a collaboration with the research support team at the Atelier. So I first applied to a research program of 9 months as a postmaster student at ANRT. I was part of the first graduating class since the reopening of the ANRT in 2012. And 1 year after, I was also the first one to continue my research as a PhD project. So the Atelier provide an academic setting to pursue at the university this research as a PhD project. And that's why my thesis is not in typography, but in linguistics. I was supervised by linguists and type designers, type historians, and it was the same for the Viva. Half of the jury was from linguistic fields, and the other half were related to type design or type history. My PhD was supervised by Alice Savoie, who's there, she's typeface designer, teacher, and researcher in type history. And I was also supervised by Jan Grub, who is a researcher fellow in historical linguistics, and he's the director of the FEV. So ANRT and Atelier were the 2 institutions involved in the program. Atelier is a research institute for the study of the French language that is held by the CNRS, the National Institute for Scientific Research, and the University of Lorraine. This research institute is in charge of several PhD students every year. At the Atelier, it's where the FEV is written and digitalized today. And it's also a place where you can find a huge amount of lexicographical resources. So ATypI supported my work by offering me a proper working space during all the PhD, and it was really enlightening to be surrounded by the lexicographer and such a huge collection of dictionary. So the other part of the structure was the ANRT, the National Institute for Typographic Research. That is a postgraduate research course specialized in type design and editorial design. It was created in 1985, and now ANRT is part of the Nancy Art School. Research projects at ANRT are mainly based on a strong relationship between theory and practice. So you can apply to the program with a self-initiated project, or you can also join a pre-established research program, as I did for the dictionary and my project. This thesis was the beginning of a partnership between ANRT and ATypI. And this thesis was the first thesis co-supervised by the ANRT at the University of Lorraine. Since then, ANRT has joined a PhD school at the university, and it will make easier for ANRT to supervise some PhD in the future. I was really lucky to have my PhD fund with a 3-year research grant. So half of it was funded by the former Lorraine region, now Grand Est. This institution allows financial support for doctoral projects, but this funding should only support half of the price. So for the other part, it was the Nancy Art School, where ANRT is located, that funded the other half. So it was a great support from the school, and it was also the first PhD they fund. And in addition to this grant, I also have the opportunity to teach 1 or 2 typography classes every week to undergraduates at the art school in the communication design department. So it was also a great way to build link between the very specialized ANRT and the rest of the school and teachers. This economical context allowed me to work and progress really regularly during all the project and to finish it into 4 years. And just to give you a clue about how it's going now after the PhD, so the FFA research project is still ongoing. As a way to support young doctors at ATypI, we can have ATypI provides the possibility to become an associated member right after finishing the PhD. So I'm still administratively attached to the research institute and to the university. And that's great because I can punctually ask for financial support for attending or taking part to conferences, for example. And I can also sign a paper I write with the university and the research line name on it and have the support of my fellow colleagues at the lab. I'm still working on the project with some computer engineers to implement the design recommendation for the presentation of the dictionary. This work is going on since 1 year, and it should be ready for publication within the next month. I should also prepare the font family for an open online distribution, so it will include a little bit more of drawing and some type production. And another part of the project is to work on the publication of the thesis as a book, also in the next months. And to finish, I still work on the field. In fact, I'm getting linked with other structures, like, for example, an Italian etymological dictionary, really close to the FFA, that is called Lessico Etimologico Italiano at the University of Vienna. And also another dialectology lexicographical project called Glossaire des patois de la Suisse romande, here in University of Neuchâtel. So the connection between typography, linguistics, and lexicographical project is getting clear through the PhD and after. And a few words about what is going on now at ANRT about typography research and PhD project. So ANRT works actively on PhD programs since the reopening. Several former postgraduate students keep working on their research projects as PhD students now. These PhD programs are partly supervised by the INRT in partnership with other institutions. So there is here Eloisa Perez, who is a PhD candidate in Information and Communication Science since 2016. Sébastien Bignac, who is PhD candidate in Geographic Information Science since 2016 also. And Pierre Fournier, PhD candidate in Design and Egyptology since this year. So this PhD project includes, all of them include an important part of type design or typography or graphic design practice. Some other students started PhD program, but not specifically with a specific supervision for the INRT. And two INRT supervisors today are implied in research project also. Émilie Rigaud, who just started a PhD project on Japanese type, and Alice Savoie, she's there, and she's involved in a postdoctoral research on the project Women in Type at the University of Reading, and I think we will hear more about this today. So I thank you for your attention. Sorry for the voice.
All right, hello. I'm going to open up my keynote now and improvise for a minute. I live and studied in Germany. Germany is a different animal. There are practice-based PhDs in design in Germany a little bit. It's not the standard model. I'm going to talk more about the standard model. German universities don't grant PhDs in topics. There's no such thing as a PhD in typography or a PhD in media studies, which is what you might call my PhD as being a PhD in. Rather, doctorates are given in philosophy or in the natural sciences or engineering, etc. So terminology is completely different, and the frameworks in which things happen are surely similar to the way things happen in Austria and maybe Switzerland at universities, but not necessarily with the Anglo-Saxon world or with France. So I have a long sort of biographic slide here that I'm not going to actually address in talking, but you can have a look at it. It's going to come up again. I was asked to talk about the context in which my doctoral studies took place and what it was like. I'm not going to talk about my research in and of itself. Why did I start a doctorate in the first place? By 2011, I wanted to leave my job at Linotype. A half-time position at the Art University in Braunschweig opened up. And I applied for that position and got it, and then was able to leave Linotype. Most visual design courses in Germany aren't at schools with full university status, but in what is different than in some other countries, Germany's few state art academies are considered as being on equal footing with universities. So you can study design inside Fachhochschulen, which are the successor schools of trade schools or polytechnic schools. And indeed, that's where most German designers are educated. But there are also state-run art academies, which are smaller institutions than Fachhochschulen or universities, but which are legally universities and therefore can confer doctorates. And starting and doing a PhD were required parts of the job that I wanted to get in Braunschweig, so I had to apply for the job and explain to them why I would be good for the job, but also say what my doctorate was going to be about. Now I'm going to move on to resources. So a lot of the resources that I would have liked to have had were lost during Allied bombing campaigns on German cities during the Second World War. This is a slide, I hear laughter. This is the Klingspor foundry in 1944 after bombing campaigns on Offenbach. These are things that were lost, but the arrows don't necessarily point to the parts of the former buildings where those things were stored. This is also applicable to most other German type foundries from that time. It's just the photo of the damage that was easiest to get. So, not least because I'm standing near the Somme, I should stress that I don't mourn the loss of this source material, really. My ancestors fought the Germans too, and the country's type foundries were legitimate military targets. I live in Berlin, and I wanted to find a topic that would let me do most of my research there, as opposed to in the school in Braunschweig. I thought that this would allow me to maximize the amount of time that I had available for researching. Berlin, as you may know, became the capital of a unified German state only in 1871. The city's libraries and museums today have excellent depth when it comes to the decades between 1871 and the First World War. Their collections include publications on typography and printing, but also type specimens from many of the type foundries that were active in those years. The specimen collections were particularly strong for companies that were based in Berlin itself. If I had lived in Leipzig or Frankfurt, I'm sure that I would have selected another area from Germany's type founding history to research, simply because of the kinds of resources that those cities have available that Berlin does not. So, for instance, the 18th century would be a great time to research if you lived in Leipzig, or in Frankfurt, you could look at the 20th century, for example. In addition to type specimens and the great number of secondary sources on German type founding that were published over the last 150 years, I also relied on the trade journals published by the printing industry. These were almost entirely available to me, and they were valuable for my research because they offered real-time reports on the activities of the firms that I investigated. They were also vehicles for type foundry advertising, and type specimens often accompanied these as supplements. These kinds of sources were particularly important because there are no records from type foundries at this time that I could consult as primary sources, or not many, anyway. So during my near decade-long process, the Berthold Type Foundry archive, the post-war archive, the pre-war archive had been destroyed, moved from private ownership in Bavaria to the public German Technical Museum in Berlin. The first part of this archive that the museum made available to researchers was Berthold's 800-item company library, which includes almost all the specimens that Berthold printed, as well as many of the specimens from various companies they acquired over the course of about a century. So I mentioned that Berlin's collections had depth. That meant that I made far fewer research trips to other cities than I had initially thought would be necessary. However, I did make extended visits to archives in Munich and in Offenbach, which hold many of the few surviving drawings made by type designers from the period I was researching, like this drawing by Ekman for the Ekman Schrift, which is at the Klingspor Museum today, probably because it was not on the premises in 1944. The drawings, coupled with some correspondence from designers that was also in those archives, were helpful additional sources for me to consult. Otherwise, as I mentioned already, I relied almost entirely on published text, and all in all, my process was primarily historiographic. There are many ways in Germany by which one can tackle doctoral studies, and I was fortunate to fall into the traditional method, which meant that I had a half-time job for a university professor. In my case, she was our professor for typography and book design. This meant that my doctorate was basically funded, although the funding was a little indirect, because I was strictly paid for other work instead of my own research. Oh, good, the color changes are visible on that slide. You might already see a pitfall that this system had for me. I made this chart myself in more ways than one, and that bar represents a 40-hour work week. You can probably notice that there is no mention of time for writing or research. This is because I was doing everything wrong. The job that I had was essentially intended for someone in their mid to late 20s who had just finished their master's degree and was willing to keep living a frugal student lifestyle for a few more years. I was already in my early 30s, and I had been out in the professional world for some time. Additionally, my previous studies hadn't been in Braunschweig, and indeed, I lived 2 hours away from the campus. My experience was the reason that my colleagues hired me over any of the other candidates for the job. But my expectation to spend so much time doing other work and so little time researching and writing soon became a problem for me as far as administrators at the university were concerned. Now, this was a state-funded job, so my pay went up slightly every year, but to put things into perspective, during my first year of this job, my cheap Berlin rent was still cheap in Berlin in 2011, plus my large student loans from studying at the University of Reading, plus the cost of riding trains back and forth between Berlin, Braunschweig, and Darmstadt, where I was also teaching, totaled up to more money than what I was being paid by the university. So freelance work was an economic necessity for me. One thing that I missed during my grad student years in Braunschweig was the kind of structure, and indeed, what I think is the camaraderie that many PhD students at schools like Reading have. I mentioned that there's more than one way to get a doctorate in Germany, and there are dedicated research groups centered around specific topics at some universities, where you might do things like group projects, or at the very least, have intermediate review of your dissertation chapters. My doctorate had no deadlines and no official pre-submission review process. I was very lucky to have a good relationship with my boss, who was also my doctoral supervisor. That's the way it works. And that kind of dual role is common, but it's a situation that unfortunately doesn't always work out so well for everyone. I was very lucky, and the good terms that I was on with my boss allowed me to have proper discussions about my research with her and also to get real feedback. But this was always ad hoc. No one was going to make me sit down and finish, not even her. Eventually, I was able to restructure my life as well as various people's expectations and carve out enough time to actually write. Nevertheless, my job in Braunschweig was temporary, and after 5 years, I had reached the end of the amount of time that university administrators were willing to pay people at my job level for. At some German universities, you could have that kind of job for 6 years, but Braunschweig went through a restructuring process and put a cap at 4 years. And since I was already there when this reformation went into effect, I got to have a 5th year kind of as a compromise. For those of you considering doctoral studies in Germany, my experiences may be somewhat applicable, but they're not repeatable. Our typography professor in Braunschweig is retired now, and the research position that I inherited from Jörg Petri has fallen victim to state budget cuts. Mariko, who some of you might know, was what German universities call external doctoral candidates, which means they don't get paid. At least theoretically, any professor at a proper university in Germany can take on external candidates that way, as long as those candidates meet the academic standards for doctoral students. The last 15 months of my writing process were spent outside of university employment. On average, my time breakdown over that period looked like this. By the time that this chart describes, though, I was already a parent. I ought to have been born in 2016, so getting more than about 40 hours of work in most weeks became a tough thing to do. But eventually, I submitted my dissertation, and I defended it too. Doctorates in Germany aren't officially issued until after publication, but I have all of my forms signed off on, and I brought my files to the printer on Tuesday. So, hooray. What happens next? Well, just last week, an eminent type designer told me that thanks to my turn away from practice and toward research, I had no prospects for future success, and that I would die in poverty unless I could get a job as a history lecturer at one of the various type programs represented by attendees in this room. I am going to hope that his advice was some combination of his being hyperbolic and a little out of touch, but I currently have no university-level home or a specific framework within which to carry research out under. So I'm looking for new opportunities for the future, and that might even include some kind of postdoc if I stay lucky. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Sebastian, Jerry, Barbara. I'll start by presenting myself. I'm a graphic designer and a teacher from Porto, Portugal. I graduated in communication design, did a master in visual communication, then a PhD in science and technologies of communication, not in typography. I teach graphic design and digital design undergraduate and graduate courses in a polytechnic, technical university, if you like, up in the north of Portugal called ESAD, Superior School of Design, IPCA. So I'll start by describing a little bit the higher education system in Portugal. It goes, well, you have the bachelor, the 3-year program. This is within the Bologna process. Then the master, typically 2 years, and then the PhD, normally a 4-year program. I did, well, I'm from the previous century, so I did a 5-year undergraduate and a 2-year master and finally a 4-year PhD. Right now, only universities can offer the degree of a PhD. Fortunately, the law has changed recently, so soon polytechnics will also be able to be included in this network. So within this scenario, I'll be talking a little bit about my personal experience in this system, both as a student and as a researcher and as an educator. In all of these years of work, there's been 2 things in common, mainly books and letters in its many forms. And since very early on, my parents, and especially my mother, she has educated me to appreciate the beauty of the book. And she has literally taught me how to make a book, how to bind the book in the Portuguese manner. How to love books inside and the outside. This is her handwriting. She has a funny notion of layout, and these are her hands. And so, of course, with the books in mind, I started doing my master in visual communication. It had to be on the topic of book design. I did some explorations of various aspects of the book, symbolic, the historical. Anyway, all of these explorations taught me what I know today and what I still teach in my book design classes today. So a note for some of the people starting this type of line of research. Of course, you have to write for the scientific purposes, but also write for your future self. It's a big investment that you're doing, so try to think, how am I going to use this information in future projects? So one thing I got curious at the time in 2008 was these things around the identity and the role of the book. Of course, in 2010 the iPad appeared, and then endless discussions about the quality of the book, the end of print, discussions that started and ended, fortunately. But these kinds of discussions have always happened, as everyone knows. But it was true that there was a slightly different scenario at the time, and that one made me to want to keep on investigating the book, now maybe in a PhD form. However, this will to initiate a PhD wasn't completely volunteer at the time. I was already teaching it at IPCA. So in order to keep my job, I had to have a PhD. That's how it goes, at least if you're an integrated full-time teacher. In Portugal, I had to have a PhD, and there was a really tight time frame because government wanted to boost our rankings in international scientific and academic reports, so everyone had to be a PhD, no matter what. So I applied for a research grant, I got it, started my investigation, then the crisis came and the funding was cut, and I had to go on with my PhD regardless. Me and lots of other colleagues, but I'm not here to complain. We finished it, most of us at least, and I got to keep my job, so everything's fine. In 2009, there weren't actually any PhD programs within the Bologna process yet, so I had to enroll in some kind of PhD. I ended up in a slightly different scientific area, that of sciences and technologies of communication. So how was I supervised? Actually by someone coming from the information sciences, from the archives, philology, and someone, the director of the design department, which happened to be an engineer in computer sciences. So not really anyone coming from the design world. So I got very proficient in this exercise of translating the design lingo to plain Portuguese and then back to the scientific language. So it was a nice exercise for me. And my team had to do with the way communication takes place at that time and today, mainly the technological developments that had occurred in the publishing universe for the last 3 decades, regarding some demand for a change in the publishing, in the design, and in the production of books, but not any kind of books, specifically the technical book, because of its need to be permanently revised, because of the diverse nature of the contents, because of the type of the readers, the production workflow. So it really was the perfect object to study. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about the PhD itself. I'm just quickly going to explain what kind of methodology I used, some techniques retrieved from the content analysis. I did some interviews. That was really how I got my data. I had to repeat some of those because there was a big gap in time, so some of the data I got in the first interviews got obsolete. So that happens. You have to be able to adapt. So I looked at the editorial publishing processes mediated by technology. I tried to identify some advantages and disadvantages of hybrid edition of books, and ultimately trying to somehow contribute to frame some good practices in the technology used by the editorial designers and within this production of the book design. So. And then in 2014, the final public defense happened in front of a 6-people jury, just very much like you. Actually, it was kind of worse because we have to wear this weird costume in black. I never had that before, and it was very hot and. In September, not a good idea, at least in Porto. Anyway. That happened. From those two have the special important job of making the hard questions and building up some real discussion. One of them was very, very knowledgeable about this, everything about publishing world and even book design. So it was a really interesting and fruitful discussion. The other one, on the other hand, had no clue about whatsoever what my project was about. So I ended up having another one of those lost in translation discussions. So I think you also have to be prepared to this. Not everyone understands, I'm not saying that whatever you write is the right form or correct, but you also have to be prepared to, there are always going to be some misunderstandings and try to adapt. So in the end, everything good. I graduated with distinction, happy ending, and it did end. And then after such an intense years, there was nothing. And it's kind of weird. And some of you that have finished it already probably felt that. But quickly this went away, and what I felt like was I could take off my researcher training wheels and I could start doing what I really enjoyed doing in terms of research, at least. Also other things that I postponed for many years. And so I did. The first thing was organizing the 5th edition of the typography meeting. This is a meeting that happens every year in different design schools in Portugal. There's Jerry on the right corner. That's when I met Jerry. And now I'm going to do some plain publicity. Next year it will be in Caldas da Rainha, in the center of Portugal, so everyone is invited, of course. These events serve many purposes. First, the establishment of a community around typography and all things type. Also, the opportunity for students. It happens every time in a design school, for students to attend workshops, conferences by relevant people in the typography world. The fees are very low, so it's very accessible. And finally, our own academic purposes, the organizers and the people presenting papers, by having a scientific committee, peer review of papers that are submitted, and later on these are published in proceedings books. So our goal is also to get this book to be indexed so that we can reach some recognition within our traditional institutions that only measure quality through bibliometric parameters, which is unfortunate, so anyway, we're trying to get the best out of these two worlds. And then I have to talk about these two guys, of course. Some of you know them. This is Pedro Amado and Vítor Calhas. These are two good friends that have become my two research partners for a long time, especially in summer vacations, because that's when we really have time to do research, actually. We come from three different research centers in Portugal, but we've managed to keep working together nevertheless, and even create some synergies between these three institutions, which is nice. For instance, in 2016, we started a project to study the role of traditional letterpress in Portugal today, and to see if we're currently undergoing a revival of letterpress there, and we did a series of interviews with professional typesetters or printers that were formally trained, but also studios and workshops run by professional graphic designers with no formal training. And as you can see, there's a huge part of the territory that is not yet studied, and Portugal is not that big, but there's still a lot to do. The project evolved, and then we decided to organize our own conference on the theme. That happened just last week. We held workshops, talks, and an exhibition, and we were working also on a book, gathering the best contributions. This is some images of the first workshop. We started with some generating patterns with processing. Then we did some 3D printing with resin and also laser cut, and going to the hand-proof press. And we got some nice results just playing around. I'm going to... no, I wanted to control the video. No, it doesn't allow me. It's going to take a little while. Let me see how I'm going with time. No. Oh, again, I'm sorry. I'm going to skip it. Otherwise, I won't have time. It's a pity because there are some images of other workshops that include risograph with letterpress. There were as many workshops as there were communications, actually. So the warm-up workshops really warmed everyone up to the conference itself. There was also time for some typos, like in the upper left corner, post-digital letterpress printing. It was made in the workshop with Richard Kegler and Emilia Fontanelle with the P22 block system. It was very, very nice and playful. This in the lower corner, there's a small image of the exhibition, and then Alexandra Korolkova, Catherine Dixon. Well, it was a nice couple of days. And since then, and I have to rush, I have 1 minute, and since this is a seminar, doctoral seminar, I would also like to tell you something about the Portuguese landscape, not only about myself, but I think more interesting would be the national scenario in what regards typography in the academia. And but my other research activity has to do with the project Design Observatory. It's being established to collect, analyze, interpret, and represent the Portuguese design ecosystem, and hopefully support, develop, and influence some design policy. It's a funded project for 4 years, and we're just at the beginning. But one of the first findings has to do with the areas in which design PhDs are developed. And as you can see, there are only 7 PhDs with the keyword typography registered in 3 of the national databases. So this is some food for thought for us, at least. It surprised me because there are lots of master projects being done in typography, but not really PhDs. And we have a very active community, actually. We just recently created an association called ATypI, not ATypI. It is, but this activity is not necessarily driven by academic work, so at least not a PhD, not at the PhD level. But this joint venture, the Design Observatory, started with a group of teachers and a general educators meeting called Rede, Reunião de Escolas de Design. This leads me to the final part, and I'm finishing. The final part of my presentation, the education. Besides my teaching work, I also do a lot of workshops, most of them with Pedro, and one of the latest ones started with within the course of digital typography in the digital design master of IPCA. So these are not students that are studying typography. They are studying, they come from many backgrounds, from journalism to product design, and some, of course, graphic design. So with Pedro and Julien Prier, you may know him as Boogie Paper, we designed the collaborative type workshop towards the design of a variable font. I have to, so yeah, I'm going to rush. This ended up with some interesting results, and this evolved to another version of the exercise this year, just with Pedro. This time it's an ongoing project, and it has a creativity app tool behind it, the Slowtype, the slot machine for typography. It's really just like very much like Type Cooker. It generates a design brief, but this is aimed specifically at this class of students. So, and these are some of the type specimens the students from previous years did, and I finish a little bit over my time. Thank you very much. Merci.
Okay. Pause over. Thank you all 6 of you, Sahar, Petra, Sarah. No, Sahar, Petra, Borna, Sarah, Dan, and Catarina. I'm trying to do it in order. We arranged people alphabetically, but actually there was a neat sequence in this because we had people who are in the process of doing a PhD first, followed by people who had completed more recently than people who had more experience in the post-PhD world. So there's a neat sequence in this. It was extremely interesting to hear the different perspectives. I think we don't have enough opportunities for these kinds of testaments from the point of view of the researcher. And a lot of themes came up, things that had to do with the trajectory of the research project, the problems of how the project will change throughout its process, especially if you're working with collections that throw up all sorts of things along the way. The relations with the supervisors and the support network is very interesting, and it's really important that it is on record because apart from the official relation with the supervisor, the wider support network of the immediate community of researchers and people who can help you is critical to the success, and it is, I think, correctly, as you've all said, generally unacknowledged, especially by institutions that need to put their money in that direction and provide the spaces and the opportunities for researchers to have that support. It is also important to notice the theme of the what happens next, that the PhD becomes this self-justifying activity that you are only thinking about that while you're doing it, and then when you finish, the system we're in often sort of dumps you in a situation where you're thinking, well, now what? And again, this is a problem for institutions, but more widely also for the education network, where you might have people who have invested significant amounts of time and effort and money into essentially a bet that there might be a suitable career opportunity afterwards. I think Dan's comment also of the risk that an academic activity might represent in a field where your peers might be spending the same amount of time in an entirely practical discipline is very real. So it assumes that the academic world will shape in a way that helps your trajectory 4 years from now, which is actually quite a significant bet. And there are, I think, echoes of things improving. Even activities like the diagnosis of maybe there are not enough PhDs with typography in title, but the fact that we are asking these questions now, which we didn't 10 years earlier, is progress in some degree. And the recent changes of which institutions can or cannot award PhDs is relevant in our case. So I've summarized these as things that I noted as applying across the experience, which spans also both stages in the research and countries. And I think it would be good now to open up the discussion to questions or comments or responses from the audience, and then record responses by our panel. Liron.
Hi. Sorry. First of all, thank you. This was, first of all, extremely interesting and also fascinating, because I think some of the things like funding and struggles with PhDs are not things that often get discussed. So in conferences, usually people talk about their research, but not about the process. So I think this is just so valuable. And what I found also interesting and enlightening for me was the motivation to do the PhD. Some of you stated that you wanted to do a PhD, and some of you were talking about some interest that grew into a PhD. So if you could maybe quickly, just one sentence each, to say what was your initial motivation for this?
In one sentence, it was getting into academia. Again, if your family's all doing it, you're sort of silently shamed into doing it. No, my family's great. But I think it's that thing of wanting to get into academia, and plus just I genuinely enjoy it. I genuinely enjoy the research process, and this was an opportunity to just learn more about that and going about that.
Yeah, I'd say that it's also my case. I love my work and I want to do it on school with the guys I'm doing it together, because that allows you to be really into your topic much more than on everyday commissions and on everyday work.
So in my case, I had to keep my job, so I really had to have a PhD. But it was always, it was in my plans before that. So it wasn't in my plans doing in such a short time. I wish I had had more time to expand the investigation. But it was. There was some previous motivation, but also it was boosted by an economic necessity of having a job.
So in my case, the alternatives weren't really appealing for me. This was the best thing that I could do, I think, with my time, and also having done MA/TD and writing the dissertation gave me the foundation to basically continue this research. And yeah, I didn't want to have a full-time job as a designer, so I thought for a while I'd do a PhD.
For me, it was a kind of surprise, because first I started as a postmaster program, and then the topic was full of interest, and so it was logical to keep going, and everyone just get into the process and help me to find a good place and a nice organization. So it was, yeah, just going like this.
When I returned to Germany after finishing the MA/TD program in Reading, I started getting opportunities to teach as an adjunct in design programs because of my degree in Reading, and also because the typeface that I designed at Reading was successful to a degree, and that sort of brought me on the radar of typography professors. And I was also young, which is sort of, you want kind of young, interesting people to be adjuncts. Now I'm old and boring, and the PhD thing was not a goal that I had when I studied in Reading. And indeed, as I sort of mentioned a bit in my talk, I started doing the doctorate because it was an opportunity that came up at a time when I was looking for another job. And if that had not come up at that time, I may well have never done a doctorate. I did think when I started that I already had some experience teaching in the German university system, and that if I would get a PhD, that might sort of help with my future prospects. I'm not actually sure that this is the case, because now 10 years later, almost, I am in a situation where most academics think that I have too much practical experience and not enough theoretical work, and most practical design professors think that I'm a theoretician who can't draw. So, I don't know. Ask me in a few years.
Questions, comments? You have dumbfounded people in resolving never to do a PhD.
This is my secret goal of today.
But yeah, Alice.
Thank you, everyone. This is not aimed at someone in particular, but it felt like one theme that was coming back was the kind of the balance between researching and designing. And Dan has mentioned it, Sahar as well. And I just wondered whether you had anything to say about whether any of you has found solutions in the balance between doing design or doing practical work and doing research in terms of how it keeps you going or keeping you sane, or yeah. And Sahar has mentioned it before. I wondered about the others.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. I think it's extremely difficult for me to switch between design and research. One of the issues that I've had is that a sort of design that I wanted to do based on my research and a sort of thing that research my research could inform, it's not normally a sort of thing that I get commissioned to do. So with regard to Arabic script, you know how the trend is always low contrast, a sort of simplified typefaces that people are asking for, and that could pay the bills for me. But at the same time, I really want to dig into other aspects of typeface design, which my PhD could really help me with. But unfortunately, that's not what market wants, and unless we have like some sort of funding coming from somewhere else, I think.
I just find it striking that pretty much all of you are practitioners and researchers, and I feel that we're in a field where the practice and the research, there should be some kind of obvious relationship between the two, and one should feed into the other. But somehow, I think for pretty much everyone, it's like a struggle, and it's like you have to choose between one and the other, but there is no like natural relationship between both.
I'm going to just continue to be pessimistic. I picked my own research topic. I could have picked a research topic that was much more related to practice that I was doing in 2011, or practice that I thought in 2011 I might wanted to be doing in 2015. But instead, I picked a topic where I was really following my research interests, and this has no practical relationship. And I was aware of this from the beginning, and people told me at the time, well, you know, it's nice that you're doing this research, but it has no practical application. And I said, go away. And now I'm living with my, the consequences of that decision. And in fact, I find the switch between practical work and my research very difficult. I showed charts where I sort of had a breakdown in the week of 50-50. And on an average, that's the way that my time breakdown in many of the past years worked. But it wasn't really like a Monday until Wednesday at lunch do one thing, and Wednesday lunch to Friday night do a different thing. It was more like, well, this month and a half I'm going to do this practical type development project, then I'll send it to the client and invoice them, and then I can afford to do research for 6 weeks, and then I'll switch again. And I found that very effective. Good, in fact, but I missed my research more when I was doing type design work than I missed the drawing when I was doing research, which did put me through some sort of identity crisis.
That was nicely said. I think the same. For me, it's an endless loop. Once you finish your research, you can start over with practical part. And once you do the practical part, you can completely redraw and rewrite your thesis. So it's like up and down. And at the end, you want to deny entire work and start over another PhD.
I mean, like, as you said, I already sort of mentioned this. I should also say that when I was doing my PhD full-time, I was on a student visa. When you're on a student visa in the UK, you are not allowed to do freelance work. So that already meant that I was not able to, on my own time, sure, I could draw typefaces and I was still collaborating with some foundries, but I could not send tax reports for freelance work. So that meant that I was very much aware that I was losing touch with practice, and that was a major factor that made me make the decision to switch to part-time. So yeah, I did not want to lose that. So compromises.
Maybe I can add on that and take the discussion not to the research versus practice, but right now in Portugal we also live a strange moment where in order to be a full-time teacher, most of the time you cannot be a freelancer designer. At least if you want to keep 30% of your salary, which is a lot in a country such as ours. So it's a hard struggle to keep in touch with the reality in order to be relevant as a teacher, as a graphic design teacher, and continue with your academic duties and also research duties, because along with being a teacher, I have a 30% of my time dedicated to investigation. So it is you have to go around. Honestly, you have to go around the system in order to keep on doing some relevant work as a graphic designer or as a designer. But yeah, it's more or less the same necessity that almost all of us feel. You have to compromise sometimes, and maybe right now I may keep on being a full-time teacher for some times, but I probably in the near future I will try to balance these two parts of my life. And also the Design Observatory is very much looking at this situation in our academia in what regards design teaching in Portugal. So I hope something will change soon enough.
Thank you. It's interesting what you're saying about having to be a full-time teacher, because here it's actually the opposite. When you teach in an art school like this one, to be allowed to teach, you have to prove that you have a practice and that it keeps going.
Yes, you're in most of countries I've visited, you're hired on based on your portfolio and on your practical work, not on the number of papers that you've published and whether or not you have a PhD. Well, I have to say, when I was hired, I didn't even have a master's degree. I was just finishing, so it was based on my portfolio, but since then, we in art schools we've imported the university scheme of doing things, the classical university thing. So we didn't adapt neither the evaluation systems nor the credit units, ECTS of Bologna. Everything is really down to numbers. So we're struggling in art schools. We're struggling a lot to deal with being inside an institution such as a university and still being relevant as an art school. So it's a weird time in Portugal right now. But I'm optimistic it will change. It's going to be the negative Portuguese.
Hi. A couple of you are doing partly practical PhD where you're developing something, right? Like a font or a whole system. I was wondering, like, how I mean, for some of those things, some of you mentioned like you end up collaborating with others, and I was wondering how those collaborations happen, or how those doors are opened, and then how much effort is put from all of the different parties that are collaborating. Because I can imagine, like, you have your vision of what is best for your part of the PhD, but maybe they have their own vision for the other parts, and I wonder how those things get coordinated. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it's, yeah, mostly for you.
In fact, it was in a way learning, both sides learning how to do stuff, because lexicographers don't have any idea about what should be type design for dictionary. Even if they look to this to type all time, I had no clue of how dictionary were working, and in a way it was looking to think, talking about this, trying to decide together what should be the best option that make both of us learning a lot of things. And I think first it was the linguist that had a really technical problem that asked for people to solve, and so it could be commission work at the beginning, but going into a PhD program, in fact, completely changed the way of answering the question. And it's more opening a new way of looking at objects than finding a solution. In fact, it's still going on, and it's making everyone progressing on the subject.
I have to say that I collaborate with a lot of people on the research base, like with many scientists and many other students from Charles University or from other universities in our republic, or with on the practical part, I only consult with the designers who already designed some cursive or some script, and we are facing issues like how to program the contextual alternate better or not. So I wouldn't consider them as an integral part of the project, but rather just consultation that are a side effect of the entire process. And I have to say that I understand the practical part as a strongly individual thing, that you need to be the only whose opponent to yourself is yourself, because you have to face that there are people who would completely redraw the typeface different way that you do. And I have many people who I consulted like the drawing and how to make it better or how to make it working even better, but still it's my own decisions who turns well or not on the final work. But it would be great if I could collaborate with people who can make the font real in the practice and test it on school kids. But then I won't need 3 years, but 6 years, and it would completely enlarge the process. But still, I think when I finish this, I will not stop with the project, and I will basically continue on what I'm doing and enlarge it with people with no rush or with no school on my back, and only freely with no issue to be solved on the time and on exact deadline.
We have time for one more question.
It's a slightly naughty question because Petra and I are following you. Even though you are on video, speaking honestly, and frankly, how did you manage your supervisors?
I'm kind of lucky because I'm also working with Tomáš and Radek in the same studio. And I'm in a different position than any other PhD in my school because they can see every day what I'm working on, ask anytime they need. And even though we are going to pub, we are discussing our issues and our projects, which is unfair to the others. But at least I don't have any competitors. There is no PhD in our department, so I cannot say what's right and what's not. And my opponents are actually from another university because they cannot be from our school. So this is the hard part. I need to talk to Paleographic and to other scientific professor from Charles University of what I'm doing in the art part, and they completely don't understand it. So they basically tear apart my research, but they cannot judge the graphic part. So that's why I think I'm lucky and not lucky at the same time. Probably. Yeah, but at our school and in our country, there is just 5 people who you can talk about creating a cursive font. František Storm is completely out of the town all the time. Jan Solpera has actually worked on the typeface with Radana Lencová that I showed in the presentation, and he thought it's a brilliant typeface, and my approach cannot success. So we are both arguing a lot about it, and Radek and Tomáš are the only one who are advising me with how to program the typeface to be all workable. But basically, it won't be the typeface at the final form. It will be handwritten scripts, what will be presented with this exam in August. So, yeah, and Radek cannot draw, actually, or even write. His manuscript is wonderfully unreadable.
Anybody else comments on supervisors?
My supervisor is great.
Out of the room,
I can go.
I'll give you time to think about it. I'll go and, yeah. On the topic of supervisors, I mentioned my supervisors are Caroline Archer, who's going to speak later today, and Fiona Ross, who needs no introduction. Caroline is my main supervisor, and she is my hero. Really, I mentioned that I have support from my family and my partners, but really Caroline keeps me grounded, sane, checks in with me in my mental health. She was very much concerned about my socializing and mental health while I was in Birmingham because I arrived there and I knew nobody. So she gave me connections and she gave me a network. So it goes beyond just the fact that both of my supervisors are incredibly generous and kind with their time and knowledge, and they go through everything I send them with a fine-tooth comb. It's also the support I get, that is the emotional support and the mental support to actually be able to do this. So all I have to say for both of them is good things and just a lot of gratitude.
thought about what you...
Well, Iranians are extremely grateful, you know, both of us. But without exaggeration, I also say that if it wasn't for my supervisor, I wouldn't do the PhD. So I specifically asked for the supervisors, and they have been extremely helpful. I love you.
That's why I do it.
I think I was really happy also to work with Alice and Jan Grob, two very nice people that were here for me anytime I want. I was, as I said, I was working in the research lab, and I was next door one of my supervisors. And each time Alice was coming to Nancy, we meet all of us, and it was making the progress very, very regular, and it was easy to work with them, and they gave me a lot during the 4 years.
I simplified the course of my doctorate a lot because it was so long and it was so affected by bureaucratic and budget changes at the university I was an employee at. So I was initially, or I was hired as a research assistant to the typography professor, and she was initially supposed to be the primary of two supervisors that I would have. And I think part of why I had such a good working relationship with her was that I was entering into a process that had already been determined. So I was the second of the two researchers that she had in her last decade or so of teaching. And so I think a lot of, sort of understanding also on her part how this would work had been determined by her supervision of Jorg before me. I had a second supervisor who actually, because of some bureaucratic changes, became the primary supervisor in terms of supervision and, assessment purposes. So toward the end of my process, I still spoke with my typography professor more, but I had more influence on the shape of the final document came from this other supervisor who was a professor in media studies, or is a professor in media studies. And because this bureaucratic switch happened sort of midpoint in my process, the switch was just sort of caused for university political reasons that I'm sure happen elsewhere. All German university professors are allowed to supervise doctorates, whether they have doctorates or not. In fact, it's only at art schools that you have professors who don't have doctorates. But a cabal of other professors with doctorates decided that at our university they were going to forbid that practice. So I had to then sort of switch things around a bit. But from the other supervisor, I had to add things to my work that would not have been part of it per se, and which I may not have had to do if I would have done a PhD in Reading, for instance. I think that in the end they made me a better researcher and made the work better in terms of certain academic standards, but it was a difficult process for me to learn how to write for one person and then learn how to write for another person. I hinted at in my talk that in this kind of system under which I did my doctorate, the relationship that you have with your supervisor is key, because your supervisor is also your boss. And if you mess up while you're working or researching, you're in double jeopardy on two fronts. And it's very difficult in the German university system to switch your doctoral supervisor at all. I'm sure it's practically impossible to switch your supervisor in terms of your job responsibilities. You can sort of imagine all of the horror scenarios that occur for the thousands of people who are employed under this kind of scheme. And I was very lucky, but my luck was random, I think, to an extent. I mean, I would like to say that it's because she and I had such a good personal relationship and that we both worked on this relationship and that we were able to, but I mean, really, you know, like a lot of whether people like working with you is not necessarily dependent on things that you do or even bring to the table. So sometimes things go wrong that are outside of your control. I wish Jerry had been my supervisor.
Okay. Good. Okay. Can I sort of thank you all again and stop discussion, because Sebastian says that we need to round off the session and caffeinate ourselves. I will say again, thank you very much. I do want to add a little I'm claiming the right to do since I hold the microphone. We're getting a distorted picture here because apart from Catarina, these people don't matter because they can't affect policy. One of the key things with a PhD is that it opens you up the opportunity to actually influence education policy in an institution. It allows you to sit at certain tables, apply for certain funding, and so on. So it's interesting to consider that the impact of belonging in an environment where you have the academic credentials, or the titular at least credentials, to sit in certain tables or apply for certain projects and so on, has influence and impact maybe 5-10 years down the line, because you can shape policy. And we are getting a little bit of a distorted picture here because we're getting a snapshot of mostly people right at the beginning of this career, whereas there are people in the audience who are sort of one step down from this, applying for larger projects, building collaborative projects that draw in funds and relations that would not have been possible without either having a PhD or the network that this builds, and also the skills in talking with, like I said, talking with the linguists and so on in the language that the academic environment understands. So not everything is bad. And if you are interested in the more strategic direction of education in an environment, then for better or for worse, and I'm not having a view on this, the PhD is an entry point into these kinds of conversations. You could then say, of course, I'm not interested in this, but if you have an interesting conversation where in 10 years' time we have an event like this and there's not a single reference to Reading because maybe we overdo that, then actually that's the route. To have the people with the right skills to influence policy, so then there's nothing exceptional about one more place in the outskirts of London doing something. I just got myself fired. Okay, good. Okay, coffee break. What time should we be back?